How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Memtes, Daf 49 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, today's Daf, 3 sections. So the first one is why olahs must be slaughtered in the north. The emphasis on must be slaughtered in the north. We learned yesterday about V'shachat osa yercha mizbeach tzafona, that by a korban olah you should slaughter in the north, but that you should slaughter in the north. How do you know that you must slaughter a korban olah in the north? We learned yesterday that korban chatas must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. How do we know the same is true for korban olah? The next section of today's daf is why ashams must be slaughtered. Why ashams must be slaughtered in the north. We've learned so far about olah. We've learned about chatas. Now we are learning about asham. How do we know that a korban asham is slaughtered in the north of the Azar? And then finally, we learn about no double hekeshes. We have learned about this. It has come up in the different mesechtas that we've learned, but also already in Masechta Zevachim. We learned about davar alamed behekesh eino chozer melamed behekesh, particularly not by kodshim. We are going to learn the source of that today. We'll see some machlokas between Ravina and Rava. Friends, that is what is on the agenda for today. Let us jump in to Daf Memtes of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, we're going to begin on Daf Memches Amid Beis, about I'll tell you exactly, 2, 4, 6 lines from the bottom of Daf Memches Amid Beis, in the middle of the line. Ashkechon shchita b'olah l'mitzvah, kabbalah nami l'mitzvah, Ashkechon shchita v'kabbalah la'akev minolah. In fact, the Gemara be'etzem, we learned that by korban olah, the shchita should be in the north of the Azar. We also learned out that the kabbalah sadam should be in the north of the Azar, although Tosfos Taka points out that, I don't know, it's not super clear how we know that we learned for sure that the shechita needs to be v'shachat osa yercha mizbeach tzafona. It wasn't super clear how we know that the Kabbalah needs to be in the north by a korban olah. We learned that by a korban chatas, but not by a korban olah. That Tosfos asked the kasha, it wasn't clear to me that he actually answered the question. So, anyways, that's not an interesting one. But anyways, let's start again. Ashkechon shechita ba'olah limitzvah. Okay, so we learned yesterday that by korban olah it should be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. Kabbalah nami lemitzvah ashkechon. We also find that kabbalah sadam by an olah should be in the north of the Azar. Not super clear to me how we know that shchita v'kabbalah la'akev minolah. How do we know that the shchita and the kabbalah sadam of a korban olah must be in the north of the Azar? Rav Ada bar Ahava says, Rav Ada bar Ahava v'itema Rabbi bar Shila kal v'chomer. Well, it's a kal v'chomer. Umachatos haba mikoyach olah me'akeves olah shaba chatos mikocha enudin sheme'akeves. You hear what the Gemara just said? Says Rav Ada bar Ahava, some say Rabbi bar Shila. Well, I'll tell you why. What we learned yesterday, that by korban chatas, not only should it be slaughtered in the north, and that its kabbalah sadam should be done in the north, not just should, but must. Korban chatas must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. The kabbalah sadam must be in the north of the Azar. Now the thing is, how do we even know this bichlal? How do we even know shchita by korban chatas that it has to be in the north? From olah, right? Olah. So if the bichlal, the whole way that we know bichlal that korban chatas is in the north of Azara is from olah, so how could it be that those sort of tafel, as we're going to see in a second using this terminology, ikr and tafel, right? If we want to kind of like categorize it as the olah being the ikr, the main thing, and the korban chatas being the tafel, the subsidiary, the secondary thing. So if the secondary thing must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara, that can't be more stringent than the ikr. So then if the tafel must be slaughtered in the north, then certainly the ikr, the korban olah, must be slaughtered in the north. Again, Rav Ada bar Ahava v'itema Rabbi bar Shila kal v'chomer. Uma chatos haba mikoyach olah. Korban chatos, which is coming from a korban olah. The korban olah is the only one that's written black fire on white fire. that it needs to be in the north of the Azara. Korban Chatas is derived from the Korban Olah, and Me'akeves, and by the Korban Chatas, it must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. Olah, Sheba Chatas Mikocha, the Korban Olah, which is the source for the Chatas. Enodin Shema'akeves, certainly it would have to be slaughtered. It must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. Malachata Shekain Michaperes Al Chayve Kresis. But one second. Korban Chatas is a particularly stringent, a particularly potent kind of korban. It could even be mechaper for chayve kresos. So I can understand that it's kind of like a more stringent kind of thing, and it must be in the north of the Azara. I don't necessarily know that that's the case by the korban olah. It's not mechaper for chayve kresos. Ravina says, Ravina al kasha le Ravada bar Rava. Yeah, but the rationale, what Rav Ada bar Hava was thinking is the following. Klum matzinu tafel chamer maker, but still, say whatever you want about korban chatas. Sure, it's even mechaper for chayve kresos, but the fact of the matter is, korban chatas is derived from korban olah. Korban olah is the ikr. Korban chatas is a tafel from this perspective. And if that is the case, Klum matzinu, I'm going to read that again. Tafel chamer maker. Do we ever find the scenario where the tafel is more stringent than the ikr? No. The ikr is the more significant one, is the more extreme one. And therefore, if the korban chatas must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar, then certainly the korban olah must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. Marzucher Rav Mari says to Ravina, wait a second. Is that a hard, fast rule? You can't find any scenarios where the tafel is more stringent than the ikr? I'll give you some examples. Vari Meiser. What about Meiser Sheni? Dehu nifte. Meiser Sheni. You want to be podet? You don't want to schlep the produce to Yerushalayim? All right, no problem. You could just transfer the value onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim. But if you have Meiser Sheni money and you go to Yerushalayim and you buy produce with that money, that produce is more stringent. It can't. Eino nifte, it can't be redeemed. Its value can't be transferred onto money. Right? Once you use Meiser Sheni money to buy produce and stuff in Yerushalayim, you can no longer be poda that produce. So, at least as we're going to see according to Rabbi Yehuda. So we see that in that context, what has been purchased with Meiser Sheni money, the lakoach mikesef Meiser, which should be the tafel in this context, is more stringent than the ikr, than the Meiser Sheni itself. Meiser Sheni itself can be poded. A lakoach mikesef Meiser Sheni can't be poded. The Tanan, as we learn in a Mishnah, halakoyach b'kesef meiser shenitma. If you have produce that was purchased from Meiser Sheni money and that produce became tamei, yipodeh. Tanakama says no problem. Redeem, right? Yipodeh that produce, transfers value onto money and buy new stuff. Rabbi Yehuda Omer yikaver. Rabbi Kiva says no. Rabbi Yehuda says no. It can't be poded. It must simply be buried. There's nothing to do with it. So we see that the tafel, the lakoach mikesef meiser, bekesef meiser, is more stringent than the Meiser Sheni itself, which is able to be poded. And for the Gemara, hasam lo alima kdushase limitpas pidyona, to which the Gemara says, no. Perspective is everything over here. Sure, you're viewing it from the perspective of, wow, the lakoach bekesef meiser is more stringent. You can't be poded where you can be poded the Meiser Sheni. But if you look at it from a different perspective, you could say, how about this? The kedusha of the Meiser Sheni is stronger and more potent than that of lakoach bekesef meiser. The Meiser Sheni itself is a stronger level of kedusha, and therefore it can be transferred onto other things. It can be transferred onto money. But once you use that money then and purchase produce in Yerushalayim, the level of kedusha on that produce is weak, such that it's untransferable. It can't be transferred onto other things. So actually, from that perspective, the ikr, the Meiser Sheni, is actually stronger right? It's indicative of the strength of the kedusha of the Meiser Sheni, that it could be transferred onto other things, as opposed to the lakoach bekesef Meiser. It's a weaker level of kedusha. The tafel is therefore weaker than the ikr, and it can't be further transferred onto other things. Varei Tamura. What about Tamura? What's Tamura? Tamura is if you have Ruvain the sheep, and you say, I'm going to bring a korban shlomim, and you say, Ruvain the sheep, you're going to be my korban shlomim. Okay, so Ruvain the sheep is now hektish. Okay, Givaldig, it's going to be a korban. Amazing. And then you say, actually, you know what? Scratch that. I want Shimon the sheep to be, okay, Shimon the sheep is going to be the korban instead of Ruvain the sheep. So that's what's called Tamura, and both Ruvain the sheep and Shimon the sheep are now kadosh. Now, Tamura is kind of the tafel here, right? The ikr is Ruvain the sheep, right? That, right? You said, I'm going to bring a korban shlomim. You set aside Ruvain the sheep to be your korban shlomim. That's the ikr over here. You then say, oh, well, instead I want to offer Shimon the sheep, and then it becomes a whole mess. Wait, you can't do that. It becomes Tamura, and now both of them. Clearly the Tamura is the tafel here. The ikr is Ruvain the sheep. Shimon the sheep is the tafel, is the Tamura. And yet, when it comes to the ikr, when it comes to being makdish a korban, if when going over to Ruvain the sheep, I say, Ruvain the sheep, you are going to be my korban shlomim. The thing is, Ruvain the sheep is missing a leg. Ruvain the sheep is a Baal Mum. Ruvain the sheep will not have kedushas haguf. It'll have kedushas damim. Sure, you say, okay, Ruvain the sheep, I'm going to bring you as I'm being makdish Ruvain the sheep. Ruvain the sheep is a mum. So it'll be kedushas damim. It will have monetary value. You'll redeem it and give that money to the temple treasury. And then when you redeem Ruvain the sheep, if it has a mum, so then it's completely permitted. Normally, if you have a korban and a korban gets a mum, if you have a korban and then the korban gets a mum, so you could redeem it, but all you could do with it now is just slaughter it and eat it. You can't work it or shear its wool or anything like that. But in this case, you say, Ruvain the sheep, I'm going to bring you as a korban. Ruvain is a Baal Mum. So it's kedushas damim. You simply redeem it, and it's completely mutter. You can do whatever you want with Ruvain the sheep now. So we see that when being makdish a Baal Mum, actually trying to make a korban, the korban itself, if it's a Baal Mum, it does not become kadosh kedushas haguf, only kedushas damim. And yet, if you're makdish Ruvain the sheep, and Ruvain the sheep is completely healthy, mamish, amazing, mazel tov, right? Ruvain the sheep is now going to be your korban shlomim. Amazing. It's a kosher animal, givaldig. And then you say, actually, I want Shimon the sheep to be my korban shlomim instead. Now, Shimon the sheep, which is now Tamura, is a Baal Mum. Guess what? Shimon the sheep is kadosh kedushas haguf. Shimon the sheep is now holy as kedushas haguf. Now it has a mum, of course, so you can't offer it as a korban. So what do? You sell it, and then I imagine maybe you'll probably bring a different korban, probably with that animal, with that money. But anyways, whoever buys Shimon the sheep, the Tamura, can slaughter and eat it, but can't work it because it's kadosh kedushas haguf. So what do we see? We see that when being makdish Ruvain the sheep, if it has a mum, it doesn't become kadosh kedushas haguf, and that's when you're actually being makdish it as a korban. It's not kadosh kedushas haguf, only kedushas damim. And yet, when it comes to a Tamura, which is tafel, it's like a secondary. It comes from the actual korban, right? Ruvain the sheep is that, assuming Ruvain the sheep is healthy and it's actual korban, and then you say, I'm going to make Shimon the sheep instead, and it becomes a Tamura, kind of like in this context, I guess, more tafel to the actual korban itself, Ruvain the sheep. And yet, when it comes to being makdish an animal as a korban, if it has a mum, it does not become kadosh kedushas haguf, only kedushas damim. And yet, if I make a Tamura of Shimon the sheep, and Shimon the sheep is a Baal Mum, it does become kadosh kedushas haguf. What do you say about that? If we say that the actual korban is the ikr and the Tamura is the tafel seems to be more stringent than the ikr. When it comes to Tmura, the ilu kodshim, when it comes to being makdish an animal, makdish Ruven the sheep, if Ruven the sheep is a balmum, lo chayle al balmum kavua, if Ruven the sheep is like missing a leg, let's say, so then Ruven the sheep would not be kadosh kedusha saguf, and yet the ilu when it comes to Tmura, chayla. When it comes to Tmura, if you say, you know what, actually instead of Reuven the sheep, assuming that Reuven the sheep is healthy and it's actually going to be a korban shlamim, then you say, actually, you know what, I want to offer Shimon the sheep, but Shimon the sheep is missing a leg. Shimon the sheep actually becomes kadosh kedusha saguf, and whoever buys it can eat it, but can't work it or anything like that, or shear its wool. So the Gemara answers in some ways kind of like similar to how we answered with the Meiser Sheni, that it's perspective. Temura mikoach kodshim asya v'kodshim mikoach chulin kaasi. Again, it's perspective. Yes, there's the perspective that we were looking at initially, which is, well, when it comes to Reuven the sheep, you're actually being makdish Reuven the sheep, whereas Shimon the sheep, it's only a temura. But another way to look at it is that Reuven the sheep, at the time that you're being makdish it, at that time it's only chulin, right? Reuven the sheep is missing a leg, and you say, Reuven the sheep, you are now chulin, I want to make you into a korban. Well, it's now, what you're trying to do is make a chulin into korban, and we're saying, no, you can't make this chulin into a korban because it has a mum, and it's not going to be kedushas aguf, it's only going to be kedushas dam. Again, because what you're really working with chulin. Reuven the sheep right now is chulin. And you're saying, I want to make you a korban. No, you can't make it into a korban. It's only be kedushas aguf, adam. It's not going to be kedushas aguf. But when it comes to Tmura, you're actually dealing with kodshim. We're talking about when Reuven the sheep is healthy, and you've already said, Reuven the sheep, I'm going to bring you as a korban. And then you make a Tmura, you say, instead of Reuven the sheep, which is actually kodshim, but we're now working within the realm of kodshim, not chulin. We already have set aside Reuven the sheep, which is a healthy sheep, as a korban, and now you want to say Shimon the sheep is going to be instead, and we say no, you can't because Reuven's already a korban and it's already kodshim, and now it becomes a tmura. So mikoach Reuven the sheep, which is now a korban, comes the tmura, which we're saying is kadosh kedusha saguf. So from that perspective, when being makdish Reuven the sheep, and Reuven the sheep has a mum, we're dealing with chulin at that time. And yeah, chulin is not going to be kedushas aguf, it's going to be kedushas dam. But when we're dealing with Shimon the sheep, who's a baal mum, and Reuven the sheep is healthy and he's already been set aside as a korban, well, now we're in the realm of kodshim, and that's why it's more stringent, and that's why Shimon the sheep becomes kadosh kedushas guf, because it's within the realm of kodshim and not in the realm of chulin. So actually, from that perspective, I can understand why chulin, why the temura that's a balmum would still be kedushas aguf, because it's dealing with kodshim rather than with chulin. Hari Pesach. What about a korban Pesach? That who eno toun smicha v'nisachim v'tenufas chazav ashok. Korban Pesach, there's no smicha by korban Pesach. There's no nisachim, nisuch minchas nisachim. None of that. There's no tenufa. You don't wave the breast and the thigh. The ilu moser d-day. But if you have like a leftover, if you didn't offer you set aside a korban pesach, you didn't offer it as a korban pesach, so it's kind of tafel. That korban pesach is ikr. The moser pesach is tafel, and yet ton smicha v'nisachim v'tenufas chazav ashok. You have to do smicha. It needs nisachim. You have to do tenufas chazav ashok. So how do you count for that? Seems like the Moser Pesach, the Tafel, is more stringent than the Iker. Pesach b'shar yemos hashana shlomim hu. No. Pesach, as we know, shar yemos hashana, every other time of the year other than the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, a korban Pesach is actually a korban shlom. So it's not that it's Tafel, it's not a Moser Pesach, it's actually a different korban. It's a korban shlomim, and a korban shlomim requires smicha v'nisuch, so it's not a matter of Ikr and Tafel, it's a matter of Korban Pesach versus Korban Shlomim. Okay, so to sort of, I keep on trying to think of this word. I'm recording this literally right after I recorded yesterday's daf, and I think I tried to remember this same word when I was recording yesterday's daf an hour ago. But anyways, just to I think I said yesterday I was suggested like check in, but check in is not the word. Whatever. Just to remind ourselves. I feel like I had the same literally the same conversation with myself on yesterday's daf. I feel like I should like go and find that in yesterday's daf and like edit it into here now. I think I literally had the same conversation with myself yesterday. To check in, no, not to check in, remind ourselves. Anyways, just to remind ourselves, we were trying to figure out how do we know that an Olah must be slaughtered in the north. So we said, well, because if the Chattas must be slaughtered in the north, and the Chattas is Tafel, and the Olah is Iker, you can't have the Tafel be more stringent than the Iker. Olah is the Iker, it must be slaughtered in the north. And we tried to find examples of the Tafel being more stringent than the Iker. We failed. Okay, fine. So therefore, to answer that question, how do we know that the Olah must be slaughtered in the north? Because it's the Iker. And if the Tafel of Chattas must be in the north, then the Olah must be in the north. V'baisema, alternatively, Amrikra ha-Olah bimkoma te, that the pasuk says, actually by a korban Chattas, it says, V'samach es yoda al rosh achatos, v'shachat es achatos bimkom ha-Olah. The Olah, the specific place of the Olah, the Olah must be in that place, and it is me'akev, you must slaughter the Olah in the north of the Azar. And now we move on to the next section of today's daf, why ashams must be slaughtered in the north. So far we've discussed Chattas, we've discussed olahs, now we are discussing ashams. How do we know that ashams must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar? Asham minolan tabai sofan. How do we know that the korban asham, right? Of course, the first Mishnah is Mukaman. Kodshei kochim shchitasa bat safon. Kodshei kochim need to be slaughtered in the north. Asham is kodshei kochim. How do we know that it also needs to be slaughtered in the north? Minolan tabai sofan. How do we know this? The chsiv, as the pasuk says, bimkom asher yishchatu esa olah. Yishchatu esa asham. What pasuk is this? So I'm going to read you this pasuk, okay? The pasuk says, "V'zos Torah asa asham." Oh, this is the olahs of an asham. Kodesh kodashim. It's kodshei kodshim. B'makom asher yishchatu esa olah, yishchatu esa asham. V'ezdamo yizrok ala mizbeach saviv. There you have it. The pasuk says this is the halacha of an asham. In the place where the Olah is slaughtered, the asham is slaughtered. There you go. So again, asham and olah debai tzafin. How do you know that the asham needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azar? The chsiv, as the pasuk says, bimkom asher yishchatu esa olah, yishchatu esa asham. In the place where the Olah is slaughtered, i.e., in the north of the Azar, that is where you slaughter the asham. Okay, so the shchita needs to be in the north of the Azar, right? Right? How do I know the Kabbalah Sadam also? Well, the pasuk says right after that, "Ve'ezdamo yizro kibudamo nami b'tzafon," and also its blood, right? The pasuk says, right? Bimkom asher yishchatu es ha'olah yishchatu es achadas ve'ezdamo, and also its blood. So the Kabbalah Sadam needs to be in the north of the Azar as well. Kibul dama damonami b'tzafon. Fine, okay. Mikabel atzmo minalan. How do I know that the one being the person who is receiving the blood, the kohen who is receiving the blood, also himself needs to be in the north? Damo v'ez damo. We could have just said, it could have said vidamo yizrok, but it says v'ez damo. The v'ez is extra to include that also the Mikabel himself must be in the north of the Azar. Givaldig. So now, this is great to teach that an asham should be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. How do we know that an asham must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar? Well, Kra Achrina Ksiv. We have another pasuk. Now this pasuk is by an asham mitzora. We're going to have some interesting discussions now about an asham mitzora. So the korban asham of a mitzora. So Kachvina Ksiv v'shachar is hakeves. I have the Shittim Kubes adds v'shachar is olah. No, v'shachar is hakeves. Right. So this is talking about a mitzora on the 8th day of his purification, at the last step of his purification. So he brings a chatas, an olah, and an asham. And it says v'shachat es hakeves. You'll slaughter the keves, the asham. Bimkom asher yishchat es yishchat or yishachet yishchat es achatos ve'es olah. You'll slaughter the asham in the place where you slaughter the chatas and the olah, and therefore it's doubling down to say that you must do this in the north. Okay, so basically we had this sort of general pasuk by Asham, right? The first psukim said, "V'zos Torah sa Asham kodesh kodashimu bimkom asher yishchatu es ha'olah yishchatu es ha'asham givaldik." So we had psukim by Asham saying that it's got to be in the north. Now by Asham mitzora, when we're talking about Asham mitzora, it says, "V'shachar es hakeves bimkom asher yishchat es hachadas es ha'olah." You'll slaughter the Asham mitzora in the same place where you slaughter the olah and the chatas, i.e., in the north of the Azara. So it's doubling down, right? We already knew from the first pasuk that it needs to be that Asham is in the north of the Azara. So now we have another pasuk by Asham Mitzora, that also needs to be in the north of the Azara. So there you have it. It's doubling down to say it must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. But one second. Is this really what's going on over here? Is Asham Mitzora really coming to double down and saying that by Asham in general, it must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara? What about the following brisa? Dover shehoya bichlal v'yotza lidon b'dover hachodosh iatar rashai lachziro lichlalo ad shechzirenu hakosov lichlalo b'feirosh. Doop boop boop do 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 do. Friends, this of course is from the parak of Rabbi Shmuel Omer that we also say right after Ezehu Mekoman in the Korbanis. What does it say? Let's read it again. Davar shahaya bichlal. If you have something that was included in the general rule, so meaning we had the first psukim by Asham, which said, I'm going to read it again, Vizos, Torah, Asham, Kodesh, Kodashimu, Bimkom, Asher, Yishchatu, Olah, Yishchatu, Asham, etc. So we had sort of a general rule for Ashams that they have to be in the north of the Azar. But then all of a sudden, we have Yotze Min HaKlal. All of a sudden, we're talking about Asham Mitzora. Asham Mitzora should have just been a regular Asham, but all of a sudden, we're talking about Asham Mitzora on its own right, in its own right. So you have a Davar Shaya B'chlal. Asham Mitzora was just like every other Asham, but it was taken out of the general category, and all of a sudden we're treating it separately. V'yatza lidon b'davar hachodesh, and it was taken out from the general rule to teach about something new, that Asham Mitzora, of course, the blood is applied to the ear and to the bahonis. Iyata rashay lachziro lichlalo. So once something is taken out from the group, there's no turning back. Right? Once the Asham Mitzora leaves the Asham community, it's on its own. Any olahs of Ashams, like having to be in the north or anything like that, no longer applies to an Asham that's left its community. And therefore, right, so again, davar shahaya b'chlal, something that was in the group, v'yatza, but it was taken out of the group, it left the group, lidon b'chavin b'davar achadash, because it had to teach some new halachas for it, right? It decided that it was doing its own thing, right? Asham Mitzora leaves the group of the community of Ashams to say that I, in Asham Mitzora, my blood is going on the ear and the bahonis of the Mitzora. Well, anything that would apply to Ashams no longer applies to it. You can't just return it to the community of Ashams and say that all the halachas of Ashams apply to it. Unless the Torah tells us explicitly, it's back. yes, all the olahs of ashams apply to Asham Mitzorah as well. But unless the Torah tells us explicitly that the general olahs of Asham still apply to Asham Mitzorah, we would have to assume that they don't apply to Asham Mitzorah. What's this all to say? This is all to say that since an Asham Mitzorah was specified on its own in order to teach that the blood of the Asham Mitzorah needs to be placed on the ear and the bahonis of the Mitzorah, the Torah then also needed to tell us that the shchita of a asham, or we're going to see also about the emurim and the dam, but basically the Torah needed to tell us that the general olahs of asham still do apply to the asham mitzorah. So basically, when the Torah is telling us these general olahs of an asham by an asham mitzorah, it's not to say that, for example, the shechita of an asham must be in the north of Azor. It's not doubling down to say that it must be, that it's ma'akev, it must be in the north. No, it's coming to teach that the olahs of asham are still relevant to the Asham Mitzorah. The Asham Mitzorah was included with the rest of the Ashams. It left the rest of the Ashams because they need to teach about the ear and the bahonis. And once something leaves the general category, it's stripped of all the halachas of that category. Therefore, the Torah needed to say that these halachos still do apply to the Asham Mitzorah. It's not to double down. It's not like it's extra and it's just like, why is it double down? Because it's to teach us that it's ma'akiv. No. It's to teach us that these halachas still do apply to the Asham Mitzorah. Ketzad also, v'shochet es hakeves bimkom asher yishchat es hachatas v'sa'olah bimkom hakodesh kichatas ha'asham u'v'gomer she'ein tam lo kichatas ha'asham matam lo kichatas ha'asham l'fis yotze, etc. Okay, I'm going to read that again. So Ketzad, so how does this? So I'm even going to read that again. Back up 3 lines. We have this principle that we know from from Rabbi Shmuel Omer. Davar shahaya b'chlal v'yatza lidom b'davar achadosh iyat rashay lachziru l'chlalo ad yachzru enokasav l'chlalo b'feirish ketzad. So how does this play out by Asham Mitzorah? It plays out in the following way. Well, by Asham Mitzorah it says v'shachat es hakeves, and you'll slaughter the Asham Mitzorah bimkom asher yishchat es hachatas v'sa'olah, where you would slaughter the chatas and olah in the north. Bimkom hakodesh ki kachatos o asham uvegomer, because the asham is like the chatos. She'ein tamud lomer kachatos o asham, that it doesn't need. Why is it saying that the asham is like a chatos? Matam lo makam, it says kachatos ko asham kachatos o asham lefi sheyotzo asham mitzorah lidon davar achodosh beboen yad uvoen ragel vozen yumanis, that because the Asham Mitzorah left the group of all the other Ashams because it needed to teach something new about Asham Mitzorah, that the blood is applied to the ear and the bahonis of the Mitzorah. So Yachol lo yeton matan damin ve'murin legabim mizbech. Is it possible that, well, once the Asham Mitzorah has left the group of Ashams, of all other ashams, it's stripped of all the halachas of ashams. And how do I know even anymore that an asham mitzorah, its blood and emurim need to be put on the mizbeach? That there's rikas adam and emurim burned on the mizbeach. How do we even know this anymore? It's been stripped of everything. So tamuloma kachata so ashamu. So that's why the pasuk says it's coming to reinstate it like all of the other ashams, and it's saying by an asham mitzorah that the asham is like the chatas machatas to unamat and dam ve'emur in the gabim mizbeach, just like a korban chatas. The blood is thrown on the mizbeach and the emurim are burnt on the mizbeach. So af asham mitzorah, also an asham mitzorah, to unamat and dam ve'emur in the gabim mizbeach, also an asham mitzorah. There's matan damim, there's emurim in the mizbeach, and also the same would apply as well to the halachas of the shchita b'tzafon. Kilu when the Torah is saying by Asham Mitzorah, kachatas ka'asham, it is not, or was it kachatas or asham? It is not to double down and say that by ashams in general, they must be slaughtered in the north. No, it's to say that when the Asham Mitzorah left the general group of ashams, it was stripped of all halachas of asham, and therefore the Torah had to reinstate it to all those halachas by saying ki kachatas o asham, to say that all the olahs of chatas, like Zrikas Adam, Haktaras Emurin, Shchita Batzofin, also, these still do apply to the Asham Mitzorah, but it is not to double down and say that the Shchita in the north is Ma'akev. So the Gemara says, no. Shchita in the north is Ma'akev, and it by an Asham, and it is learned from Asham Mitzorah. Imke nichtov bahai velo nichtov bahai. If it was not to be ma'akev, then just write it by Asham Mitzorah and not by the general psukim by Asham. What does that mean? Well, like we learned the other day, like we brought up on Daf Mem Vav, another concept from Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Kol davar shahaya b'chlal v'yotza min haklal lelamed lo lelamed al atzmo yotza ela lelamed al klal kulo yotza. Right? That was something that we had learned the other day, also from Rabbi Yishmael Omer. That when you have something that was included in the general group, like the Asham Mitzorah was included like all the other Ashams, and then it left the group, right? And it left the group to teach something. It's not only teaching about itself, but to teach about the entire group. So if it was simply to teach, so if all we wanted to do was to know that there is a halacha, in general, when it comes to Korban Asham, that it should be slaughtered in the north, well then don't write anything about slaughtering in the north by the general pasuk, right? We saw the first pasuk that we saw was Vizos Torah Asham. I'm reading the pasuk. This is the halachas of Asham, Kodesh Kodashim, Bimkom Asher Yishchatu Olahs Yishchatu Rad. So in the general halachas of Asham, it said that it has to be slaughtered in the north. Don't write that. Don't write anything by the general halachas of the Asham. Only write by the Asham Mitzorah that it needs to be slaughtered in the north. And I'll say that it's not teaching just about itself, it's also teaching about the whole group of Ashams. But it does say it in both places. It says it in both places to say that it's not just that you should slaughter it in the north of the Azar, but that you must slaughter the Asham in the north of the Azar. Right? So, if it was only to say that Ashams should be slaughtered in the north of the Azar, so just write it by Asham Mitzorah, and I'll say that the halacha of Asham Mitzorah really applies also to the whole group. But it says it in both places to say that you must slaughter the Asham in the north of the Azar. So Anicha isvirlan yatsa lidam bedavar chadash iu hu dilo gomer mi chlalo aval klalo gomer mine shapir. Right. So if you hold of this principle of kodavar shabachlav yatsa mekal lamed lo lamer al atzli lo moyatsa el lamer al klal kuliyatsa. Right. That in our context, that if you hold that by shlomim leaving, if by Asham Mitzorah leaving the general group of Ashams, it doesn't just teach about itself, but it also reflects on the entire group. Givaldi. Right again. Okay, if you hold Yatza Lidon that the Asham Mitzorah left the group to teach Badavar Chadash something new, it is not learning anything from the general group. However, Aval Klalo Gomer Mine, but the general group learns from it. Right? So it's teaching about the entire group. Shapir, okay, fine. That's a valid argument, right? It should have only had the north, the Shchita Batzafon by the Asham Mitzorah, and it would have reflected back on the entire group. Sure. But Ela Isvirlan de lo hu gamar michlalo velo klalo gamar mine. But if you don't hold of that, and therefore just like it, right, the Asham Mitzorah isn't learning out from the general Ashams, also the general Ashams are not learning from the Asham Mitzorah. Well, if that's the case, well then, Hai legufe itzrich, and you can also add v'hai legufe itzrich. If that's the case, that neither the Asham Mitzorah nor the Ashams in general are learning out from one of the other, well then, you need by the general Ashams to say it has to be slaughtered in the north, and also by the Asham Mitzorah to say that it has to be slaughtered in the north. But both are necessary. Neither one is like extra and doubling down. Both are necessary because they're not learning out from one another. So, and for the Gemara, interestingly, if you look at the pasuk by maybe some of the what's the word I'm thinking of? The inquisitive eyes of some of the Chevra Babble on Talmud already noticed the pasuk by Asham Mitzorah says I'm going to read the pasuk. So it already says earlier in the pasuk, you'll slaughter the asham mitzora. You'll slaughter it where you slaughter the chatas and the olah, i.e., in the north of the azar. And then again it says kachatas asham, that right there, that the asham mitzora is like a korban chatas. Why do we need it to say it basically twice in the pasuk? Right, once already. So the Gemara says, "Kim da ahadre." Once already, the pasuk says, "Ki kachata so asham." That no, we're treating the asham mitzvah like a chatas, that it needs to be slaughtered in the north. Then why do I also need earlier in the pasuk to say, "V'shachat esakaves bimkom asher yishchat esachatas esolah"? What's that for? That, my friends, is to double down and say that it's ma'akev, that you must slaughter the asham in the north of the azar. Okay, so came the hadri. Once at the end of the pasuk, it says, okay, fine. The asham tali is like the asham mitzora is like, the chatas, and it needs to be in the north. So then I don't need the first part of the pasuk to be telling me that you slaughter in the north. That is to double down and say it's makiv. Amarle, Marzutra bre de Rav Mari de Ravina says Marzutra bre de Rav Mari to Ravina Ema. I will say that when the pasuk says ki kachatas o ashamu la koin to the koin, so maybe I'll say, look. Maybe when the pasuk says ki kachatas o ashmu la koin, it's saying specifically the zrikas adam, the aktaris emurin, which are things that are done by the koin. Those things need to be in the north, right? Those things are by a asham mitzora. But shchita betzafon de lo baya kahuna, which does not require kahuna. Why would that necessarily be included? Right, shchita. Right, shchita doesn't have to be done by a kohen. Right, shchita bizarre is kshera. So maybe when it says ki kachatas ashmu la kohen, maybe it's not talking about shchita, and therefore we wouldn't learn there that shchita batzafon. Right, shchita of ashmu mitzvah needs to be batzafon. So shchita de lo baya kuna lo bin baya tzafon. Maybe it shouldn't have to be in the north. Im kein nema kra ki kachatas hu. My kachatas o asham kishar ashamus ye. Could have just said ki kachatasu. It's like right. You could just say ki kachatasu la koin. That it's like a chatas to the koin, and I would say, right, yeah, things that like that a koin does by a chatas, the blood, the emurim, but it says. My kachatas ha'osham, why does it say the osham, kishar ashamus yeh, to say that it's like the other ashamos, i.e., that it does, in fact, need to be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. And friends, now we arrive at the third and final section of Daf Mem Tes of Masechta Zevachim. No double hekeshes, right? As we've learned about recently. Okay, that's something that's learned from hekesh. Can't then in turn learn something else from teach something via hekesh. Let's go weiter. Okay, why by the asham mitzora does it have to point out why does it have to say that the asham mitzora is slaughtered in the same place where not just the chatas is slaughtered but also the olah is slaughtered, i.e., the north of the azara? Why not just say where the chatas is slaughtered or where the olah is slaughtered? Why say both? Why do you need both? So why does the asham mitzora need to be compared both to the chatas and to the olah? Amar Ravina, says Ravina. We're going to see. Okay, let's go weiter. Amar Ravina, says Ravina. It's derech. We need them both. Well, here's the thing. If we're trying to learn out, how do we know that asham mitzora needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azar? And we say, oh, well, we learn it from chatas. The thing is, how do we know that chatas needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azar? It doesn't say it by chatas. It itself is only learnt out from olah. Which would mean that you would have chatas, which is lamed mi hekeshes, right? Something that it itself is only learnt out from olah, is now coming and being the authority and teaching about now ashams. You can't have something which it itself is only a derivative, now being the source for something else. It has to come from the source. So Avamina, I would say, chatas meichan lamda. How do I know that echatas bichlal is slaughtered in the north of the Azara? Me'olah. Well, it's only learned from Olah. Dover alamid behekesh, chozum lamid behekesh. Then I would conclude that something which itself is a derivative, something which itself is learnt out, is now going and teaching and being the source for something else. So therefore, I can't just have chatas there. I also need asham to be there. But Amar Marzutra Breder of Mari Liravina v'nikshei le'olah. Okay, well if that's the case, why do you need chatas there? Drop chatas, and just like chatas is learned out directly from Olah, learn out asham directly from Olah as well. So just drop chatas. Say, how do we know that the asham mitzvah needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azar? Ka'olah. Can you just say, v'shachat esakeves bimkom asher yishchat esa Olah. The Olah is in the north, and we'll learn out from Olah directly that asham mitzvah also is in the north. Just drop chatas. Why do I need that? Why do you need chatas there? V'nikshei le'olah v'lo nikshei lechatas. Just compare it directly. Just learn it directly from Olah. Drop chatas. Well, if that was the case, then Hava Amina, I would say, what's his base? I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything important. Okay, if that was the case, Hava Amina, Davar Lamed Bekesh, Chozim Lamed Bekesh. The thing is, here's the thing. We actually want to weigh in over here on the concept of Davar Lamed Bekesh, Chozim Lamed Bekesh. More specifically, Davar Lamed Bekesh, Eino Chozer Lamed Bekesh. Here we have an opportunity to teach the halacha that something that is learned out via a hekesh cannot then be the source to teach via hekeshes, right? Meaning, something that is itself a derivative cannot now be the source for something else. So, by including the chatas and the Olah, we have an opportunity to say, why are they both here? Well, because we would be unable to learn out from asham from chatas, because that would be right. Davar lamed me'ekesh chozim lamed bekesh. Therefore, we also need the Olah here because chatas on its own can't teach. Now, the thing is, if we would only have the Olah and just learn out asham mitzvah directly from Olah, we wouldn't think there wouldn't be any indication to learn anything about davar lamed bekesh chozer lamed bekesh. V'haraya, the Gemara doesn't say this, but I'm saying this. Keilu, yesterday we learned all about today, I don't remember what's what. Probably yesterday we were learning about how we learn out chatas from Olah. Nobody thought to say anything about davar lamed bekesh, chozer lamed bekesh, because it was just chatas learning directly from Olah. Pretty straightforward. So if we would just learn out asham mitzvah directly from Olah, it wouldn't teach us anything. We wouldn't have an opportunity to learn anything about davar halamed bekesh, chozer lamed bekesh. By saying that the asham mitzvah is learned out both from the chatas and the asham, asham mitzvah is learned both by chatas and Olah, we have an opportunity to learn that davar lamed bekesh eino chozer lamed bekesh, which is why we can't just have chatas, and right. So we have to have Olah there, but we also include chatas in order for us to kind of like go through this exercise of needing Olah there and chatas alone being insufficient. V'chi tema. So again, so Hava Amina davar lamed bekesh chozer lamed bekesh. So I might think, right, I wouldn't have the opportunity then to, if I just learned it out directly from Olah, I wouldn't have the opportunity to learn davar lamed bekesh eino chozer lamed bekesh, and I may have thought, therefore, right, absent of any other guidance, I might think that davar lamed bekesh chozer lamed bekesh. So this was an opportunity to teach eino chozer lamed bekesh. V'chi tema, and if you're going to say, what's the gimel here? Is it important? Okay, imkain. V'chi tema imkain nikshei akushe lichatos. And if you're going to say that, well, if we were to learn, meaning if you're going to say, just learn out asham mitzvah directly from Olah. Just learn out asham mitzvah directly from Olah, and I'll say that proves that davar lamed bekesh eino chozer lamed bekesh, because if we would say davar lamed bekesh choser melamed be'hekesh, well then it should have learned from chatas. And from the fact that it doesn't learn from chatas, it must mean davar lamed be'hekesh eino choser melamed be'hekesh. No, I wouldn't draw that conclusion, because I would still say, I could theoretically still argue davar alamed be'hekesh choser umelamed be'hekesh. Okay, so then why not learn from chatas? Because nicha le demakish le leikr v'lonakish le letafel. Because no, I would say davar lamed be'hekesh choser melamed be'hekesh. So why not then just learn it out from chatas, from the derivative? Why are we learning that from the Olah? Well, because it's better to learn something from the source. Meaning, in principle, you can learn it out from chatas, but the Torah is only saying Olah because the Olah is the source, so better to learn it from the source. That is why the pasuk says both chatas and Olah, to make clear the point. To make clear the point that something that is learned from a hekesh, right, cannot then become the source for to teach about something else, right? If it would only have Olah, I might still come to the conclusion that davar lamed be'hekesh choser melamed be'hekesh, and that the reason it didn't learn out directly from chatas is because it's better to learn out from the source, from Olah. But in principle, davar lamed be'hekesh choser melamed be'hekesh. Therefore, to sort of stomp out any such havamina, the pasuk says both Olah and chatas, in order to make the point that chatas alone is insufficient, and you need the source there as well, because davar lamed be'hekesh eino choser umelamed be'hekesh. Rava Amar Melacha. Rava says that we learn out the principle of davar lamed be'hekesh eino choser umelamed be'hekesh is learned out from here, from, as we've seen in the past, par koin Mashiach, par elam davar shel tzibur, and sa'ir avoda zara. Right? We learned recently that the klayos, the shtei klayos, the oseres hakavod and the shtei klayos, the emurim, that are specifically written by the par koin Mashiach, also apply, are also burnt by the par elam davar shel tzibur, and from the par elam davar shel tzibur we learn that too the sa'ir avoda zara, that also there's the Yoseres hakavod v'shtei aklayos. Now, Rav Amar Me'acha, Rav says it's learned from here. The pasuk says by par koin Mashiach, that it says specifically by the par koin Mashiach that the Yoseres hakavod and the shtei aklayos, the diaphragm and the two kidneys, are burnt on the mizbeach, and then it says kasha yura mishor zevach hashlamim, like is burnt from the, like is offered from the from a shlamim. Why does that need to be written by the par kohen Mashiach? Like, why is it important to say that it's like the shlamim? Well, it's not needed for it, because it already, meaning if it just said kasher mizervach hashlamim, so I might say, okay, by shlamim there's the yoseres hakavod, the shtei aklayos, that also applies to the par kohen Mashiach. But it says explicitly by the par kohen Mashiach, yoseres hakavod, shtei aklayos. So clearly the kasher mizervach hashlamim is not necessary for the par kohen Mashiach. What's it there for? Why is it there? If it's to teach that the par kohen Mashiach, you have to burn the yoseres hakavod and shtei aklayos, it already says that explicitly by the par kohen Mashiach. Rather, mishum debai agmure yoseres hakavod v'shtei aklayos mi par elam davar shel tzibur l'sir avodas kochavim. Right, as we've learned before, that the sa'ir avodah zara, the chiyuv of to burn the yoseres hakavod v'shtei aklayos, is learnt out from the par elam davar shel tzibur. The thing is, what's the vav over here? I'm going to read this note. Ufar elam davar shel tzibur, back in the Gemara, begufei lo ksiv par kohen Mashiach hu de gomer. Now the thing is, as we've seen in the past, that it doesn't specifically say yoseres hakavod v'shtei aklayos by the par elam davar shel tzibur. So we have the par elam davar shel tzibur that's teaching the chiyuv to burn the shtei aklayos and yoseres hakavod. It's teaching from the par elam davar shel tzibur to the sir avodah zarah. The thing is, it doesn't explicitly say it by the par elam davar shel tzibur. Where am I? So beguvei lo ksiv mi par kohen Mashiach hu the Gomer. Par Davar Shel Tzibor, we only know Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros from Par Kohen Mashiach. So you have Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros by Par Kohen Mashiach, which is then taught to the Par Davar Shel Tzibor, which is then taught to the Sarah Avodah Zarah. So la'achi itzrich kasher yuram. So that is davka why the pasuk says kasher yuram mizevach hashlam mishor zevach hashlamim by the par kohen Mashiach. It's extra in order the nehavi kiman the chasa begufa to make it. It's extra to teach not about the par kohen Mashiach. It's not necessary for the par kohen Mashiach. It says explicitly by the par kohen Mashiach. Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros. It's not talking about the par kohen Mashiach. It's talking about the par Davar Shel Tzibor. To make it as though it's written explicitly by the par Davar Shel Tzibor that the Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros are offered. So that v'lo nehavi davar lamed behekesh chozum lamed behekesh. So to avoid davar lamed behekesh chozum lamed behekesh, meaning without kasher yuram mipar zevach hashlamim. Mishor Zevach Hashlamim. Without that, well then simply Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, the Yoseres V'Shtei HaKleros, Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros, are learned out from Par Kohen Mashiach. So Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor is Davar Alamid Mihekesh, and then it's Chozer Melamid Behekesh. It's teaching by Sir Avodah Zarah, Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros, but that is problematic. You can't have Davar Alamid Behekesh, Chozer Melamid Behekesh. Therefore, you have kasher yuram mi shor zevach hashlamim by Par Kohen Mashiach, which is extra and not needed for Par Kohen Mashiach, in order to teach for Par Davar Shel Tzibor to make it as though it's written explicitly by Par Davar Shel Tzibor, Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros, so that now Par Davar Shel Tzibor itself becomes a source, and from the source, it as a source, as a primary source, can now teach for Sarah Avodah Zarah, Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros. So we see that kasher yuram mishor zevach hashlamim is needed because davar lamed behekesh eino chozer melamed behekesh, and therefore we needed to have it as though it was written by the par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor, so that it can be a source for Seir Avodah Zarah. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava. Says Rav Papa to Rava, v'lichtevei begufe v'lo nakish. Why not just simply, well, why do I need this kasha yuram? It's kind of esoteric. Why not just explicitly write by Par Davar Shel Tzibor, Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros, and obviously it will then just be a source for the Sarah Yom, the Sarah Avodah Zarah. Well, ikasav begufe v'lo akish. Well, if it would simply just be explicit, boringly be explicit by the Par Davar Shel Tzibor, Hava Amina, so I would lose the opportunity to learn anything about Davar Lamed Behekesh, Chozum Lamed Behekesh, and I would mistakenly conclude Davar Lamed Behekesh, Chozer Lamed Behekesh, right? I would lose the opportunity to learn anything about Davar Lamed Behekesh, and I might then mistakenly conclude Davar Lamed Behekesh, Chozer Lamed Behekesh. That's why I need this whole elaborate thing in order to learn specifically Davar Lamed Behekesh, Eino Chozer Lamed Behekesh. V'chi tema nikshe akushe. And if you're going to say, yeah, but if you were going to learn out Davar, if really you held Davar Lamed Behekesh, Chozer Lamed Behekesh, so then you could have just learned out Seir Avodah Zarah from Par Davar Shel Tzibor, from Par Yom HaKippur, from Par Kohen Mashiach, and that would have simply, right, and I don't need the kasher yuram kilu, meaning if in fact Davar Lamed Behekesh, Chozer Lamed Behekesh, so then the Torah should have just set that up that way. Well, nichale dichasve begufe mida akish le akushe. Well, meaning if it would have said, right, because we suggested why not just have, we suggested why not just write explicitly by Par Davar Shel Tzibor, Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKleros. You said, well, we would lose out on the opportunity to learn anything about Davar Lamed Behekesh. What do you mean we lose out on the opportunity? I would say that, well, if it were to teach, if the halacha were Davar Lamed Behekesh, Chozer Lamed Behekesh, well then it shouldn't be saying anything by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. Right? Again, the suggestion is just be explicit by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. We're saying, no, if you're explicit by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, you won't be able to learn out about Davar Lo Mebekesh. What do you mean you won't be able to learn out? I would say to myself, from the fact that it's being explicit by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, it must mean that we can't learn Davar Lo Mebekesh, Chozum Lo Mebekesh, because otherwise they wouldn't have said anything by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. To say, I wouldn't necessarily draw that conclusion because I'll say, no. Really, I would say, look, Davar Lo Mebekesh, Chozum Lo Mebekesh. Okay, well then, why are we writing anything by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur? Well, because it's still better to write it explicitly by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur than to have to rely on Davar Lo Mebekesh, Chozum Lo Mebekesh. So really, I would conclude: look, Davar Lo Mebekesh, Chozum Lo Mebekesh. Okay, well then, why is it writing anything by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur? Just don't write anything. I'll say Davar Lo Mebekesh, Chozum Lo Mebekesh. Well, because it's still better to be explicit, to be clear, and to write it by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. So now that is why the Torah wrote things the way that it wrote things, that it didn't write anything by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, and it didn't write anything by Sir Avodah Zarah, and it says Yoseres v'Kovich Le'akleus by Par Kohen Mashiach, and it has that extra Kasher Yuram Mishor Zevach Hashlamim in order to make it as though it's written by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, because Davar Lo Mebekesh Eino Chozer Umlamed Behekesh. That was a little bit tricky. The bottom line being Davar Alamed Behekesh Eino Chozer Umlamed Behekesh, something that it itself is a derivative, cannot be a source to teach that thing to something else. Ravina learned that from Asham Mitzora needing Chatas and Olah to be there. Rava learned it out from Par Kohen Mashiach with Kasher Yuram Mi Shor Zevach Hashlamim. Chevra, that was Daf Memtes, Daf 49 of Masechta Zvachim. Friends, on Daf Memtes of Masechta Zvachim, the first section we learned about why olahs must be slaughtered in the north. Not just that they should, but that they must. The first pshat was from Rav Adabar Hava. Chatas can't be more stringent, right? You can't have the tafel be more stringent than the ikr. And if olah is the ikr, where chatas is being derived from, and chatas must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara, well then certainly you can assume that olah must be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. The other pshat was that it says, by chatas actually says, in the where you slaughter ha olah, the olah, in the place where it must be slaughtered. So the olah must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. The next section we discussed why ashams must be slaughtered in the north. How do we know asham? We've learned about olah, we learned about chatas. How do we learn about asham that it must be in the north? So ultimately it was learned out from the asham mitzora, because by the asham mitzora also it says that it must be done learned in the north, it must be slaughtered in the north, and ultimately it was kind of like a bunch of layers there. There was davar shehaya b'chlal v'yatsa min haklal. What was it? Kol davar shehaya b'chlal v'yatsa min haklal v'yatsa lidom b'davar achal she'yatu yachal achzil l'chlal ad she'achzin hakazil l'chlal l'ferish. That was one layer. Another layer was kol davar shehaya b'chlal v'yatsa lidom b'davar achal v'yatsa lamed. Like all these kind of layers came in, but ultimately what it came down to was that by Asham it says that it needs to be slaughtered in the north, and then it says it once again, ultimately by Asham Mitzora, to double down and say that Asham Mitzora must be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. And then we got to the concept of Davar Alamed Behekesh Eino Chozer Umlamed Behekesh. Ravina learned that out from Asham Mitzora, because it says by Asham Mitzora that it's slaughtered in the north, like the Chatas and the Olah. It couldn't just learn it out from Chatas because Davar Alamed Behekesh Eino Chozer Umlamed Behekesh. And Rava learns it out from Par Kohen Mashiach, whereby Par Kohen Mashiach, even though it already explicitly says that the Yoseres HaKavod V'Shtei HaKlayos are burnt on the Mizbeach, nonetheless it says Kasher Yuram Mishor Zevach Hashlamim, which is entirely extra, and it doesn't belong by Par Kohen Mashiach, but rather it's for Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor, to make it as though Yoseres v'kavod v'shtei klus are written by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibor so that it can then be a source for Seir Avodah Zarah, because Davar Alamed Mehekesh, Davar Alamed Behekesh Eino Chozim Lamed Behekesh. Chevre, have a good one. Cheers.